Maybe that I've got two students who were involved in this little scuffle. So I can ask each of them, what actually happened here? What went wrong? What were you thinking? And what were you feeling when these events happened? And what did you do in response to that? And then I can ask them, okay, what does the scripture say about that? How does God want you to react in that situation?
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for this week's episode on the Teacher Edition podcast. I'm so thankful for you, our listeners. We count it a privilege that you take time to listen in, and we trust you're walking away encouraged. Speaking of encouragement, let me again encourage you to share this podcast out with other educators. If you're listening on something like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, just click that share button and you can easily send this out to all those on your contact list. And again, we'd also appreciate it if you would take time to leave us a rating and a review. That is just so helpful in getting this show out to others. Don't forget about our website, teachereditionpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletters, read more about the show, listen to episodes, and learn more about our guests. Of course, we're also on Facebook, as well as Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. We are serious about reaching as many Christian educators as possible, and we really appreciate you visiting with us, listening or watching, and inviting others to do the same. As educators, we give, and it's just so vital that we take time as educators to be encouraged and to strengthen ourselves as well. You know, it's quite profound to say that education goes beyond the textbooks. Of course it does. But you know, it's so easy as teachers to just get so, marinated in academics that sometimes we neglect the incredible opportunity to speak into the lives of our students every day. And not just academically, but spiritually, emotionally, and so on. Our students are people like us. They experience emotions, hurts, successes, insecurities. They have moments of celebration and pride and moments when they just feel defeated, down, even angry. We've had a number of episodes discussing some of these topics and how they affect the classroom and how we can reach children, students, and speak into their lives. Today, I want to talk about anger. I guess we would be pretty hard-pressed to find a teacher who doesn't have at least one student in his or her classroom who struggles with anger. As a teacher, I had several who stuck out to me who really struggled with anger. Some struggled with it affecting their outlook, maybe their daily attitude. Others struggled with just being explosive at even just the smallest things in the classroom. You know, anger comes in many sizes and really from many causes. To talk about this topic, we are privileged to welcome Dr. Bruce Meyer back to the show. Bruce has been in education since 1993. He served as a faculty member, school administrator, assistant pastor, and a pastor. He and his wife, Kathy, have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. He's been on the faculty of 2 great Christian universities, and he's currently serving as a professor of biblical studies and counseling. So Bruce joined us several months ago as we talked about fear in students. That episode, it was great. It was so insightful. We received such good feedback on that. So I decided to ask him if he'd be willing to come back for yet another episode, and he was. Bruce, welcome back to the show. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Jenny. It's good to be here. I appreciate the time.
Okay, so Bruce, anger can be another of those emotions and behaviors, I guess we could say, that educators are often a little intimidated by. It's an emotion that can be unpredictable, even disruptive. It can be harmful to others and really to that individual. And, you know, the source can be buried deep. And honestly, as educators, it's often hard to know where to begin to address this. And especially when we have a whole class waiting, we have a tight schedule to keep. Yet all that being said, the number of angry students coming to our classrooms just seems to be growing every year. So maybe we could start there. Let's define it or identify what anger is. So Bruce, how would you define anger?
Well, I think God gave us the anger emotion to help us defend ourselves in a time of crisis. So either we fight or we flee. And we might, especially in a sinful, broken world, we might need that.
Sure.
And it's becoming more and more apparent that that is a real problem in our culture. So I think it is God-given, but the problem is, like every other emotion that we have, when sin enters the picture, it can go the wrong direction and become destructive, violent, or misguided, very selfish and prideful in how I approach even that emotion.
Okay, so of course, being in a Christian environment, there's the immediate tendency to place this emotion in the sinful bucket or the not sinful bucket. But can we really do that? Where does anger fall? Is all anger sinful? Maybe we could ask it that way.
Well, there are some Christian authors out there, not many, thankfully, but there are some who would say all anger is sinful. If that's true, then Paul had no business in Ephesians chapter 4 saying, be angry, but don't sin. And so I think what he was telling us there is it's possible to be angry about something, which anger really is helping us deal with injustice. And if I deal with that biblically, then I'm dealing with that injustice in a proper way rather than an unbiblical, selfish way. And so I would say anytime that I am dealing with injustice in a biblical way, then I'm going the right direction with it. And Jesus is a good example of that. When he cast the money changers out of the temple, he was concerned for God's glory. He was also concerned for the Gentiles who were worshiping in that area, who had no quiet area to worship now because of all the commotion. So he's a good example of good, righteous anger. The problem is for us, I think anytime that we encounter a situation that might even be a cause for justice, our anger can push to the front of the line, if we want to use that example, and become very oppressive, not just to us, but to others. So it's one of those that is very difficult to control, and I think very difficult to measure in a way that it remains righteous.
Yeah, makes sense. So we know that our students are influenced so heavily by the culture, the society around them, the mindset, the jargon, the attitudes, even the justification for behavior. Where do you see anger in that? How have contemporary models of anger influenced believers, in your opinion?
Well, in several ways, and probably too many to discuss in this short time. But one of the theories that governs what our world is doing with anger is what I could call the pressure cooker model, or what some would call the hydraulic model. And that is, anger is building up in us. And if we don't release that slowly, then we'll just explode. And you see this with the riots, where police just stand by and let rioters burn buildings and loot because we've got to let them blow off steam. That is completely an unbiblical approach. Another way that some would deal with this is say, let's just put a lid on it and squelch it, but then I'm not really dealing with this in a biblical way. And Ephesians 4 would direct us towards, I am taking this anger that is troubling me and I'm replacing it with forgiveness and love and tender-heartedness, compassion, etc. So I'm actually doing something active rather than trying to suppress it or just slowly release it or vent it. That's another model. As we go to a rage room and we throw things, we sling paint, that really doesn't solve the heart issue that's going on, and it certainly doesn't address injustice if injustice is actually occurring.
So we can talk all day about what we think of anger or maybe how others view it. But of course, we ultimately know that the Bible is our authority on all things, including anger. We also believe that the Bible is relevant to today. So Bruce, talk with us about what do the scriptures say about anger, either sinful or righteous?
Oh boy, there's a lot of data on anger. And I think that helps us understand that it is certainly one of those problems that often rises to the surface most quickly. Proverbs says a lot on anger, so I would redirect your teachers again back to the book of Proverbs just to refresh their memories. But some of what Solomon said there is that I can control my anger. A soft answer, for instance, turns away wrath. And so there's an indication there that I can respond in an angry situation with a soft answer. That's challenging, but it really goes to what our character is. It goes to whether we're walking in the Spirit or not, because if I'm in the flesh, I'm not going to return with a soft answer. I'm one that loves a good sarcastic response, and I really have to guard that in my own life. And that's one of those ways that my anger can reveal itself in a very sinful way. And so I've got to be walking in the Spirit in order to handle that quest to just get that little dig in there. Proverbs, though, the New Testament says a lot about anger. I've already referenced Ephesians chapter 4, but one of my favorite references is James chapter 4, because there, James addresses what's going on when we are involved in a conflict, and it's a terrific passage. So if we have the time, it would be nice to talk through some of those principles. We can either do that now or later, whichever you would prefer.
Let's come back around to that, because I definitely want to bring James into this for sure.
Okay. But that's just a sampling. If you've got a study Bible that has notes in it on anger, or a computer search, you can do a search on anger. There are books written on anger. Lou Priolo has a book on anger that would really be very helpful for folks to read, because he gets to the heart of the issue. A lot of anger is just viewed as a behavior issue rather than a heart issue, and we can correct the behavior without ever helping the person, the student, grow in character and in heart change.
Yeah, and I definitely want to hit a little bit more on that too, because that was one of the questions I had for you.
Okay.
But before we do that, as the Bible is our ultimate authority, Christ is our perfect example as well. So how does Jesus' example help us in understanding anger? What would you say?
I think most notably was when he cast the money changers out of the temple, and when he did that, it almost looks shocking to us. And in part because he's one against many, and so he had to show some ferocity there. But he doesn't sin in that, and that's what's remarkable to us. So when we look at his example and consider other accounts where he easily could have become angry, I think when he looks, for instance, in John chapter 11, when he is dealing with the aftermath of Lazarus' death, John uses an interesting word that Jesus is very troubled, and the word behind that English word is this idea of agitated. So I think he's upset, and I think to a degree he's probably angry, because he is seeing the effects of sin, which is death. He's seeing the effects of unbelief. He's seeing a whole lot wrapped up in that event that is deeply troubling to him, and he's agitated. And it's a word that you see after John 11 occurring in several places where he is again agitated. And I think the condition of what he is seeing in us as humans, his compassion for us, that's what's creating that agitation in him. And yet he always approaches that biblically, and that is with love and compassion, with good solutions. And casting those money changers out of the temple was a good solution. They had no business defiling the Father's house in that way. They had no business stifling the worship of Gentiles who were there to worship God as purely as they knew to do in this hubbub that was created by the money changers.
Okay, so with this groundwork laid, then where are we as believers in all this? Is it possible for believers to exhibit righteous anger? You gave that example, but where are we in that?
Okay, that's a good question. I think, one, recognizing our sin nature, and even though we're believers and we want to do what's right, when we're caught in that tension, that's when you can almost feel that, and that's why the hydraulic or the steam engine model, if you want to think of it that way, where this pressure is building up, it just feels like I'm going to explode. As a believer, though, that's where I've got to recognize the necessity of biblical renewal in my life. So I'm regenerated. I'm a new creature. I don't have to give in to those fleshly desires. I am dead to those desires, and often we forget that. But then I've got to be walking in the Spirit so that when I face those difficult situations, I'm not running after my flesh. I'm running after biblical response. I'm asking the Spirit, how should I respond to this situation? And He's going to use the scriptures in my life then to direct me towards a good response. Even if there is an injustice, let's think worst case scenario. If something happened to one of our children and the person we know who damaged our child you're going to feel that welling up inside of you where you want the justice towards that perpetrator or whatever that person is. And it's why there are warnings in the scriptures about not taking revenge and leaving that to the Lord first. And of course, leaving that to the proper authorities, Romans chapter 13. But there are times in this world that injustice can still prevail. That's why you see some of the Psalms that are written about that. But trusting the Lord's sovereignty and trusting those around me who are entrusted with that job of retribution, of punishment, of justice, trusting them to fulfill their responsibilities, that comes back to my understanding of God's sovereignty as well. So there's a lot of theology wrapped up in this that we often don't consider.
Yeah, great thoughts. Okay, so in dealing with anger in the classroom, something I have often read, I've even heard this advice spoken, is just teach the student or expect them to demonstrate self-control. And that has the firm assumption that if the student has self-control, then we're not going to have any anger issues. So that connection has given me pause over the years, definitely. So yes, there is obviously a connection between self-control and anger. I think we can see that. But what would you say? Is anger simply an issue of learning self-control? Is there any truth to that?
I think some truth to that, but if I just put this in the self-control bucket, I've overlooked the fact that this child needs a new heart. So if this child is not born again, is not a believer, then that's step one. We've got to get to salvation so that now this person has a heart for God. It also overlooks the fact that I may not be even examining what's going on in my heart desires, because when I'm angry, what usually takes over is the heart condition where I want something. And even if it's I want justice, sometimes my motive in wanting that justice isn't correct either. I'm wanting justice for me rather than the justice that I should want for somebody else who was wronged or damaged. So there's a lot that goes into this beyond just be more self-controlled. And certainly Proverbs deals with self-control, as do other passages as well. But there's a whole lot more that we can do as teachers to help our students understand that. And a good heart journal, and we can talk about what is in a heart journal,
Sure, yeah.
that would help a teacher guide a student into learning how to handle that anger when it comes up. The problem is teachers are so limited in time. They've got 20 students.
Exactly.
How do I go aside with this one and just talk with him? That might be something that works well at lunch or on the playground or what have you, where you could just ask some good questions. Let's talk about what happened this morning when you got angry, and ask those good questions. So would it be now a good time to talk about a heart journal?
Yes, talk about it. I'd love to hear more about that.
It's very simple, and you can actually add or subtract questions from this, but I usually will ask, okay, what was happening? What went wrong with this? And it may be that I've got two students who were involved in this little scuffle. So I can ask each of them, what actually happened here? What went wrong? What were you thinking? And what were you feeling when these events happened? And what did you do in response to that? And then I can ask them, okay, what does the scripture say about that? How does God want you to react in that situation? So if it's a scuffle over a toy, I wanted that toy. Well, how does God want us to handle that? Well, we're to love others first, love God supremely, but to love others before we love ourselves. And so loving my neighbor would be to say, go ahead and let him play with that toy, because most children have an attention span with toys like they do in class. It's maybe 2 or 3 minutes and they're off to the next one. And then you could play with that toy. So what should you have done and what could you do the next time this happens? And you're helping that child see the heart desire as the root issue. And that is selfishness, pride, I want. That really is the big picture issue. I'm wanting something, and that's where James hits this. So if you can teach your students, and I would even as a teacher take a class period or two to talk, let's talk about anger.
Absolutely.
And here's some scripture that helps us. And when you are angry, stop and ask yourself these questions. That would help that student work through some of those heart motives that could be now misguided towards self rather than towards loving God and loving others.
Yeah, I love that. It's not just a stop it, as often happens.
Right.
Just stop it. It actually gets them thinking, what led up to this? How could you respond in the future? I love that. So the heart journal, we definitely want to take note of that. Okay, with those great and very thought-provoking insights, unfortunately, we're going to have to sign off for today. Our time is gone for today, but we still have a lot to talk about, definitely, when it comes to anger in students. So when we come back for part 2, I would love it if we could look more at how teachers can address anger in the classroom. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to go back to that, as well as just some biblically based remedies for anger. So I'm really excited to hear more of what Dr. Meyer has to share with us. And listeners, I can assure you, you are not going to want to miss out. This is where we live. This is what we're facing regularly in our classrooms. And this is what we need to be prepared to address from a biblical worldview. So our time for today is gone, but when we come back, we'll be looking at more on this topic of anger. Don't miss out. But for now, thank you for joining us today. I hope you were challenged and encouraged by these great insights in this episode. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to submit questions and to learn more about the show. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.